What's your name?
My name is Bob Cushman.
How do you spell that?
Cushman.
Great. And are you a resident of Michigan?
I am.
How long have you been a resident?
Been a resident for about 35 years, most recently.
Okay. And are you over the age of 18?
I am.
Great. What did you witness on election night?
Well, and I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to deliver basically the address that I wanted to address last night with Mayor Giuliani.
And you weren't given the time to do that?
That's correct. After 4 hours, they shut down the meeting, so we ran out of time.
But you were one of the witnesses.
I was sitting directly behind him.
Great.
Correct.
Great.
Mayor Giuliani, Michigan representatives, and fellow citizens. My name is Bob Cushman, and I'm a registered voter in Lyon Township, and I desire to testify concerning events in Detroit on November 4th. I'm a mechanical engineer by education and a retired pilot by profession. I believe that I witnessed an indication of mass election fraud on the morning of November 4th and direct mass fraud on the evening of November 4th, while I served as a trained and credentialed Republican election challenger at the Detroit Absent Voter Counting Board's TCF Center, Detroit, Michigan. Now, pertaining to the morning of the 4th, I arrived at the counting boards at TCF Center at approximately 6:30 a.m. after being briefed in room 260. We had been advised of a very large ballot drop at approximately 4 a.m. on November 4th. And by the way,
Who advised you of that?
The attorneys. We were briefed by an attorney. I think his name was Brian. I don't know his last name.
And what did
He was like the lead attorney for the Republican challengers.
And what did they say to you?
Well, he said many things, but he basically said that, and this is the only thing that really sticks on my mind, was the fact that there was an unusually large ballot drop that happened at about 4 a.m. And by the way, one of the things I should add in is at the testimony last night that we heard, one of the affiants indicated that there was a number of 55,000 ballots associated with that. So that's in previous testimony. So I'm going to reference that number.
In the testimony last night, you mean at the Michigan House of Representatives?
That's correct.
Right. Where Mayor Giuliani spoke before Chairman Matt Hall's committee?
That's correct.
Okay. And when you say a ballot dump, can you clarify what you mean by that?
It meant in one or two vehicles, loadings, that there was 61 boxes. Now, I've heard numbers vary between 60 and 62, but I'll go with the number 61 boxes of ballots.
What
magically appeared at TCF Center. Now, keep in mind, this is approximately 3:34 a.m. the day after the election.
Why is that important?
Well, and this could be ballot bandied about, I suppose, but no ballots received by the clerk's office after 8 p.m. on the 3rd are to be counted. Now, it could be argued that they check signatures until 3:30 or 4 a.m., I suppose.
Now, some people have said that it may have been a truck that was lost that showed up with legal ballots that were collected at 8 p.m. Is that possible?
I think so. I can't say otherwise. I can't really comment on that. Of course, I wasn't even there at the 4 a.m. time span. I wasn't there for another 2.5 hours. So.
Right. But when you showed up, the lawyers informed you at 6:30. When you showed up, the lawyers informed you that there had been a ballot dump earlier in the morning.
Right.
And that's what a ballot dump is an influx of suspicious ballots.
And that seemed to coordinate with some of the testimony we heard from an electronic standpoint of the spikes, big spikes that occurred in that time span.
Great.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, it was back a little bit after 6:37 a.m. I began observing the processing of ballots at several county boards. I quickly noticed that none of the names were being scanned from the ballot envelopes were in the electronic poll books. All of the names were in the supplemental sheets. We knew that the electronic poll books had been updated on Sunday, November 1st. That meant that all of the new ballots had to be brand new registered voters registered on either Monday, November 2nd, or Tuesday, November 3rd. I found it impossible to believe that tens of thousands, and now we think it's 50,000 persons, were registered in just those 2 short days. So I began to write down all of the names on the ballots after they were scanned by the computer poll worker. As soon as I began, I was obstructed by 5 different persons such that I could no longer continue my legal responsibility as an election challenger. These 5 persons were comprised of a poll worker, a supervisor, an uncredentialed person, a Democrat challenger, and one of the top leaders of the absent voter counting boards. I do not believe that the intervention of 5 persons to prevent me from recording names of these ballots was coincidental. I'm convinced that these actions were perpetrated to prevent me from documenting the names on the ballot envelopes. The very obstruction of a credentialed election challenger to perform his or her legal duty is in fact a prosecutable violation of the Michigan election law.
Bob, so you were ejected for challenging ballots.
I was not ejected from the room. I was prevented from writing down the names.
What did they do to prevent you from doing that?
The details are my affidavits, but speaking from memory, the first thing that occurred after I began writing down the names of the ballots was that an uncredentialed person, quite tall, stood behind me and was peering over my shoulder. Now, I will say that I first assumed that this person was a Democrat challenger because it became apparent as time went on that the Democrat challengers that were there weren't really there to challenge the process as much as they were to watch and sometimes obstruct us.
When you say he was over your shoulder,
He was standing very close to me behind my shoulder, peering over my shoulder, trying to read what I was writing down.
now my understanding was that poll challengers, only GOP poll challengers, were kept 6 feet away for COVID reasons. Was he 6 feet away from you?
No.
Did anybody enforce the rules against him?
Well, no. But let me finish the story so that you can see the what I think is kind of a coordination. So the first thing that happened was that this person was peering over my shoulder. Now I assumed he was a Democrat challenger, and after I was writing, and it just seemed kind of odd, kind of awkward. So I got nothing to hide, so I held up my clipboard so he could read what I was writing. And then as I did that, I turned around this way, and I looked at him, and I saw that he wasn't dressed in any kind of casual business attire. He had a sweatshirt on. I think it might have said Michigan State. He had no credentials. Now, I assumed he was a challenger. I said, "Are you a challenger?" And he said, "No." And I'm thinking, well, this is odd. I mean, everybody in there was wearing some kind of credentials, So anyhow, I went back, or I tried to go back to what I was doing. Immediately thereon, the supervisor came over and said, "You're too close. You got to step back. You're too close. You got to step back." I attempted to tell her that, in fact, I had been part of the lawsuit the week prior, where I was a plaintiff, and we successfully sued the Secretary of State, Benson, to allow challengers closer than 6 feet to do our duty. And we won that lawsuit. And we tried to inform all of the challengers of the change in the rules, but I don't believe that any workers were informed. In fact, my wife was a worker, and she was never informed of that change, even though, of course, she knew it from me.
So for the benefit of people who may not know what that court said, the court said that you could not be required to be 6 feet away.
If we were in the process of doing our challenger duties, it's a legal requirement. And to prevent us from doing this is illegal. But that was never communicated to the workers. They've been taught prior to that just the opposite.
And so they were violating a court order.
Correct.
Would you say that anyone enforced the court order and let people? Did you observe anybody following that court order properly?
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, obviously there were times that we challengers did get closer than 6 feet, but it seemed like whenever we were observing something they didn't want us to see, they would arbitrarily enforce that. And we were afraid to fight back too much because they were arbitrarily ejecting Republican challengers throughout that day on the 4th. And so we didn't want to push back too hard or we'd get kicked out, and then that's the end of the game for us.
And so just in the layout of how things are, there's a counting board, right? And how many people are at a counting board?
There's 5 workers at an accounting board, and then there's a supervisor over maybe 4 or 5 counting boards.
Were they all 6 feet apart?
I believe that they had strategically placed the chairs to be about 6 feet apart.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then where were you in relation to the counting board?
Well, in this particular instance, I was standing fairly close to the number one person, which is the person that receives the ballot, scans it, and it's still in the envelope, remember, and then passes it on to the second person, and then around the table they go until the ballot is emptied from the envelope and the tab is torn off, and then they put it on a tray that gets run up to the high-speed tabulators.
What tab is torn off? Could you explain?
There's an extra little tab on the ballot. As I recall, that tab has the number of the ballot, so they can compare that to the number on the envelope to make sure that they match.
So when that tab is torn off, is there any way to identify whose ballot that is?
No, not at all. Once that ballot is gone, it's anonymous.
Okay.
Right.
Sorry.
Okay, so we talked about the uncredentialed person. We talked about the supervisor, and while the supervisor, I was interacting with her, and she was basically refusing to acknowledge that I had a right to be that close. There was a Democrat challenger who appeared, and he interacted sort of on the behalf of the supervisor, and he said, "But there's a repeater screen over there in the corner. Why don't you go ahead and record the names from there?" And I thought, well, that sounds like it's a reasonable request. So I went over to the corner, and what I observed was that the names that were scanned, keep in mind there's a computer operator scanning each ballot. They're scanning the ballot. The name, in the case of the repeater screen, it flashed on for like half a second and then went away. It was far too fast for me to accurately record the names, double check the spelling. So I said, well, that isn't going to work. And then I went back to my original position and tried to start writing the names down again. No sooner did I do that than the number two guy that was running the whole show came over, and he said, hey, why don't you go over to that corner screen and write down the names from there? And I explained to him, I said, I tried, but it's too, the names flash and go away too fast. So I took him over to the corner repeater screen. I showed it to him, and he said, okay, plan B, go back to doing what you were doing, but how about this? You step in, you write the names down, and then you step back. And I said, that's reasonable. So I started to try and do that. But as soon as I started to try and do that, apparently the supervisor had interacted with a worker, and he was placing all of the ballots face down on the table so that I could no longer read the names. So I interacted with the supervisor again, because I'm not supposed to talk to the workers. And I said, excuse me, ma'am, but would you please ask your worker to turn the ballots face up? And she said, no, they're just fine the way they are. And I asked her again, and she said, no, and I'm not talking anymore. If you want to talk to somebody else, go talk to somebody else. And she walked away. And that was it. So I was prevented, totally prevented from doing my job, because as a challenger, I legally cannot touch any equipment. I cannot touch any ballot. I cannot talk to a worker. I have to interact with supervisors or higher level election officials.
So, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but for the benefit of people who don't understand the process, the counting board is where they're processing the ballots.
Right.
There are 5 people you've described that,
Right.
that handle a different part of the process. They have the physical ballot in front of them. At the end of that process, they're tearing off the tab, which is the only way to identify whose ballot that is.
That's correct.
Right?
Right.
And you were not able to see any markings on that ballot because they were hiding that from you.
Well, I want to be specific here. At the point of this operation where I couldn't see the ballot at all. I was looking at and I used the term ballot, probably should say ballot envelope, because that's all I was looking for. I wanted to see the name, because the fact that 50,000 ballots show up at 4 a.m. and that none of them were in the electronic poll book was a huge red flag to me. Just absolutely monstrously huge.
What does that mean?
Well,
not in the poll book.
Well, the poll book is a qualified voter list.
What is that?
But there's a list that I guess the Secretary of State commands here in the state of Michigan, and I think it's further refined by each local community, that says these people are qualified voters in Detroit or Wayne County or whatever.
What's a qualified voter?
That would be somebody who's registered to vote, that's legally that's supposed to be a U.S. citizen. And as I understand it, I don't know if felons can vote, but they can't vote while they're incarcerated. And I don't know if they can vote afterwards. That's a piece of information I'm missing on. But there's obviously people that can vote and people that can't vote. And of course, you have to be a real person. And of course, we've already turned up hundreds or thousands of names of people who are apparently dead. So that's another, and I won't get into that because I'm not part of that research, but I've heard about it.
So would it be fair to say that that's the list of legal voters?
Yes.
And that's the list that the Secretary of State maintains, also called the qualified voter file, right?
She maintains to a degree, and she's supposed to purge the bad names out of there every so often. And I'm aware that it was requested that she give a recent purge. I think it was toward the end of 2019, and it didn't happen. And as far as I know, it's been quite a while since these records were purged.
And so when people refer to the QVF, they're referring to the poll book. Is that correct?
In part, let me further specify. The qualified voter list could be all of the voters in the state. Now, keep in mind that the absent voter counting boards, each board is made up of 1 to 4 or 5 precincts. And in the city of Detroit, I think it would be the responsibility of the city of Detroit to keep their own subset of the master voter list. But more specifically, each electronic poll book is only going to have the names of qualified voters in this grouping of precincts that we call a county board. So it's a subset, if you will.
And so again, for the benefit of people who don't know, what is a precinct?
A precinct, I'm trying to remember the definition. I think it has a maximum of somewhere around 3,000 or 3,500 voters, and it's one of the basic building blocks of our political system.
Would it be fair to call it kind of the geographic area of where you're supposed to vote?
That sounds like a good definition to me.
Right.
Yeah.
So your precinct is where you are supposed to vote on election day.
Right.
And then those precincts are collected and counted by the counting boards.
Well, the names of the qualified voters in that area, yes.
Right. So the names they would be checking against, in your neighborhood, you would be voting in Bob's precinct.
Right.
And that would be checked against the file to make sure that Bob voted in the correct precinct and that he's legally entitled to vote.
Right.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we pretty much nailed what happened in the morning and the problems that occurred. Now let's fast forward to the evening. Now I'm going to preface this discussion about what happened in the evening of the 4th by indicating that during the mid-afternoon of November 4th, the processing of ballots was very slow. We were repeatedly told that the very last ballots to be processed were going to be these military ballots. Now, as a point of reference, these military ballots are coming, I assume, from all over the world. If a person was registered to vote in precinct number 142 in Detroit, and that was their home base, and they're over in Iraq, apparently what happened was someone would take a Xerox copy of the ballot and send it to the serviceman or woman, and they would mark it up on what probably is just Xerox paper, and then they would send it back, but in order to be processed by the voting center, they had to be transferred or copied to an official ballot to be run through the tabulator. So our job was basically to oversee the copying to make sure they copied it properly, because that obviously is one potential source of fraud, is if you duplicate a ballot, either because it's ripped, torn, or whatever can't go through the tabulator, or in this case, they're military ballots, they have to be duplicated to a real ballot that can be processed by the machine. So we're concentrating on this, but here's the big thing. We were told that these were going to be the last ballots processed. And during the middle of the day, we saw these ballots sitting in boxes on the center stage, the control area, if you will, where all the officials were. And we're just kind of watching them. And then eventually, toward the late afternoon, early evening, they were transferred to what's called a distribution area. And in this distribution area, once they began to process the military ballots, at least partway through this, now I did not take a time hack, but I'm going to estimate that that was probably in the 6 to 7 p.m. time zone, we noticed that yet another long line of ballots was showing up. So obviously the military ballots weren't the last, contrary to what we've been told. So we began to ask people about this, and the answers we're getting back from the supervision, the management of the voting board, county boards, was that these ballots were ballots that had previously been rejected because the names were not in the poll book, the names were not on the supplemental sheets, so they sent them back to the clerk's office for further investigation. And lo and behold, apparently the clerk decided to take all these very, very last ballots, send them back and say process it. Now, keep in mind that this group of ballots, and I'm going to estimate it was in the 2,000 to 4,000 number of ballots, these very last group of ballots, none of the names on the ballots were in the electronic poll book. None of the names on these very last ballots were in the supplemental sheets. And I said, and as I talked to one of the top people, or one of the senior leaders up there, I said, well, why are you allowing this to take place? This can't be right. I mean, if you don't have a name in the electronic poll book and you don't have a name in the supplemental sheet, we, all of us, you or me, have no way of knowing whether these are actual people or qualified voters. And this is just wrong. One of our challengers, along with an attorney, talked to Chris Thomas, the guy that ran the whole place, and they tried to challenge the whole batch for that reason. The ability, or that challenge request was rejected. So,
is there a legal process where a challenge can be rejected?
I can't answer that. I know that we're supposed to start with a supervisor and work our way up toward the top to try and get a challenge to happen. But as long as you bring up the word challenge, let me go off in a sidebar. To challenge a ballot is 99.99% meaningless. Why? Because if you challenge a ballot, it gets processed along with all of the other ballots. The only thing that happens is they indicate a challenge number. I think they write it in pencil on the back. They put a piece of tape on it. They run the ballot right through the tabulator along with all the other ballots, and unless you can prove that that one ballot is fraudulent, then that count stays. Otherwise, you'd have to go through a legal process, and I think it has to be within a small number of days, like 6 or 8 days. If you don't challenge that, if you don't prove that that challenge ballot is invalid, it gets counted. So the whole point of challenging ballots is next to meaningless.
Why do you think they encourage people to do it then?
I think it's like a magician, where he's glittering something with one hand when he's really doing something nasty with the other hand. It's a way of placating people that get upset over what they think is fraud and what may very well be fraud. Oh, it's okay, we'll challenge it. Well, it means nothing because it's going to get counted anyways. So,
who would you, if you wanted to fulfill on the challenge, who would you take that objection to? Do you have to take it to a judge?
I'm not qualified to answer that question. I've never gone through that part of the process. But as I indicated, that I think it's safe to say that 99.99% of the time that none of the ballots that ever get challenged ever get removed. So it's meaningless. It's pointless. But let me finish the story. And this is critical. So here's a group of several thousand ballots that shows up, no justification at all to process them, and they're still processing it. Now, there's a very nice man, I believe his name was Mr. Miller, who was probably one of the lower echelons of the upper echelon of the management there, if you will. And I was advised, because I want to be specific, I think it was table number 86, and I'd have to refer to my affidavit, but there was a specific board, I think it was 86, and I saw this going on, and by the way, I noticed that every single ballot that was being processed, they were manually adding the name, the address, and then for the birth date, for all these thousands of ballots, they were indicating the person was born on January 1st, 1900. So I was advised by one of the supervisors to go up and talk to one of the head people, which I did, and it took me a while to track him down while he was solving other problems, but he was very kind, for me, I thought, to walk me to the table and show me how to challenge the ballot. But in this case, I made it clear to him, and I think he made it clear to the operator, that I wasn't just challenging the one ballot. I was challenging all of these ballots because it's in my opinion, it's legally wrong to record a ballot where there's no justification of the person being a registered voter. And oh, by the way, they're incorrectly entering the information for this person because obviously none of these people were born on what was it, New Year's Day on 1900, so they're all 120 years old. No, I don't think so. Now there might be some side procedure where they allow that, but that's still bogus. So these were all bogus people that should have never been allowed to vote, fake people, but they processed them anyways.
I think the pushback has been that it's a placeholder. That's their excuse, and that the one other pushback I've heard is that those people were previously signed off by the city clerk as being valid voters.
But there was no justification that we had.
What does that mean?
They were not in the electronic poll books. They were not on the supplemental list. There was no associated paperwork. Now, I think a third category that you might mention is if the ballot, and maybe this applies to the polls more than absentee, if the ballot is accompanied with brand new registration form for that person, that's okay. But so there's three conditions, and these ballots met none of the three conditions.
So these were just ballots. They weren't same-day registrations. We
have no way of knowing. Well, except for the fact that if you assume that what we were told was correct, is that these were ballots that had previously been rejected because their name was not in the electronic poll book, and the names were not in the supplemental sheets. So that was, if we assume that's correct, okay, so let's do it, then they were all rejected because they didn't deserve to be counted as votes, and we're getting hearsay. The clerk is verbally telling the heads of the whole county board to process these ballots, and this is hearsay. And by the way, they were also apparently the clerk's office also told everyone that you process the birth date as 1/1/1900.
You said you were lodging objections with somebody in authority, at the center. Do you remember who that was?
Mr. Miller. Well, Mr. Miller walked me over to table number 86 or board number 86, and he interacted. And of course, we Republican challengers were like death. We were not respected, and it was nice that he walked over with me and instructed the computer operator to challenge this grouping of ballots. And she typed something in, so I assume it was entered as a formal challenge. And if you could gain access to the electronic poll book of number 86, it's there. One more thing I want to add. I noticed this in the primary because I was also challenger on August 4th and August 5th, and I didn't realize it was inappropriate. But what I observed in both the primary and the general election was that when a ballot came through and the name was not in the electronic poll book, the person would just arbitrarily add it to the electronic poll book. As though, well, we assume that this is a good ballot from a real person, so we're going to add the name. That's illegal as heck. I didn't know what was going on there that clearly during the primary back in August. Now I realize that this is illegal, should never happen, but obviously it's a standard operating procedure in Detroit.
Do you think there's any legitimate reason they may have been adding people in that way?
I do not.
We've spoken with a lot of people who have witnessed the exact same thing. And I think a lot of people didn't understand what they were witnessing. Do you feel confident in saying that that was illegal, what you witnessed?
That's my firm belief, yes.
How would you define voter fraud?
Well, it's a multifaceted answer because there's many ways that voter fraud can occur.
Well, but just the simplest definition of voter fraud.
Well, I'll take a stab at that. Voter fraud occurs whenever a vote is counted, a ballot is counted, that does not come from a qualified elector and or more than one vote came from that qualified elector, which is one of the charges that's been levied against Detroit, is that they had people voting both absentee and in person on November 3rd.
And so
That would be fraud as well, obviously.
when you witness someone being entered into the QVF, the qualified voter file, the poll book, who does not belong there and was not put in there until the ballot showed up, that is illegal, right? Your understanding is that that's illegal.
I believe it is.
And
Yes.
would it be fair to call that voter fraud?
Yes.
And you witnessed that as the procedure in the TCF Center.
Yes. Yes.
And so would it be fair to say that that would be systemic voter fraud that you are describing?
I would use that phrase. Yes.
Did you see any poll workers who challenged a ballot themselves without you initiating the challenge?
I did not, but I did hear of many cases of that. But once again, challenging a ballot means nothing because it's going to get counted anyways.
Is it, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, does that mean that 100% of the ballots that came in to that counting board, challenged or not, got counted?
Were you referring to County Board number 86?
Of what you observed?
Well, first of all, one of the things that I should emphasize is that there and it was in approximately the 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. time frame, I'm walking around, stopping, observing, and there were many, many boards that were all doing the same thing. They were all manually entering this last batch of ballots, and they were all entering them manually, and they were all entering the birth date as January 1st of 1900. So in that respect to the last batch of ballots, this happened everywhere.
On election night you witnessed that, or on Wednesday?
No, everything I've testified to is on the 4th. That's the day after the election.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And these are, what you were told were military ballots?
No. That's what I was trying to clarify before. There were two, let's go back to the afternoon for clarification. There was very little processing going on for many hours on the afternoon of the 4th.
Wednesday,
the 4th, the day after the election. We were told that the last grouping of ballots were going to be the military ballots, and our instructions from our attorneys that were present was we need to make sure that they are reproduced accurately. So that was our goal, and we were thinking that what we were told was this is the last batch of ballots. What I'm referring to is a bunch, I'll call them mystery ballots. The mystery ballots, and it could have been 2, 3, 4,000, maybe more, ballots that showed up after the military ballots. And these latest ballots were processed. The mystery ballots, the illegal ballots, in my opinion, were processed in the 8 to 10 p.m. time frame.
Great. Do you want to keep going?
I think that's pretty much it. I think I've ad-libbed the tail end of this.
You've done, I think, a really good job of explaining the process. How many elections have you been involved with?
I've only been a challenger this year, first at the primary, and then, of course, at the general. I was there for 22 hours in the primary because there were not shifts. Because of all the problems that we observed, the Wayne County Board of Canvassers made a resolution to ask the Secretary of State, and I think one other part of government, to do two things. One was to oversee the election and the general election, and the other one is to perform an inspection of the training and the problems that occurred in the primary. Now, from testimony that we heard last night, this is with Giuliani, as broadcast on national TV and whatnot, from Monica Palmer, who is one of the members of the Wayne County Board of Canvassers. She indicated that she thought that because of all the additional workers that were supplied and all the additional training that seemed to be happening, that the results would be much better. But it turns out it didn't improve the results at all. Now, let me clarify, let me specify. In the primary election, and we're just talking about the absent voter county board in Detroit, they had 72% of all the precincts were out of balance. Why is that important? It's important because if a precinct is not in balance, it cannot be recounted. It's almost like that's an invitation for fraud.
What does balance mean?
Balance means, as the definition I think I heard last night was, if you have indicated in your poll book that 100 ballots were processed and you actually have 100 votes, which should also be the same number as the number of physical ballots that are in the box for that precinct, then everything's in balance. It's my understanding that most counties in Michigan have a very, very good track record. I've seen some information recently from Oakland County. They have a very good track record of balancing the number of ballots. However, in Wayne County, and especially Detroit, it's terrible. But the comparison I was trying to make was that in the primary, 72% of the precincts in the absent voter county boards did not balance. In the general election, 71%. So they improved at 1%, but that's still horrible. Why is it horrible? Because you cannot recount a precinct that does not balance, which means if there's mass fraud going on, you can't check it, you can't clarify it.
I'm sorry to maybe make you explain it once again, but when you say out of balance, you mean that the physical number of ballots does not match the vote totals that are being reported from that ballot box.
That's my understanding.
So when they say 100 people voted, there are not 100 ballots in that box.
That would be an out of balance situation, yeah.
Out of balance.
And here's another case, and I saw this being lip service that we're getting from people in Detroit. They're saying, well, it was only out of balance by 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. Makes no difference. If it's out of balance by 1, that entire precinct cannot be recounted. One of the other things that Monica Palmer testified to last night with Rudy Giuliani was that if the container is not a valid container that's been certified or the seal is broken, that cannot be recounted. And that was part of the problems that she ran into on the canvas in Detroit. So there were massive problems.
So you're describing two different things, and I just want to be very clear.
Yes, I am.
The first thing where things are out of balance, meaning that the number of ballots does not match the number of votes that are being reported from that box. When those are out of balance, you're saying that box cannot be recounted, right?
That precinct cannot be recounted, correct.
And you said of the absentee precincts, or of the absentees, 71% were out of balance.
71% in the general and 72% in the primary. Yes.
So meaning if you were to engage a recount, you would have to go off of the numbers that they've already posted for 71% of those precincts.
Right. So obviously a recount is meaningless.
Well, you'd only be able to recount 29% then of what remains.
Right. Right.
And leaving 71%. What if there was fraud at the TCF Center? What you described, it sounds like there was fraud at the TCF Center. There would be no way a recount would affect that one way or the other.
I think that's essentially true.
I think that's a really important point that I hope that we're communicating effectively, because I don't think that a lot of people understand what you're saying. And I suspect, Bob, even a lot of legislators don't understand what you're saying.
May I tag on to that comment?
Please.
Toward the end of last night's session, one of the Democrat representatives,
I believe it was David LeGrand, yeah,
was throwing a statement toward Rudy Giuliani. And he basically was saying, well, if you were that concerned about the election, why didn't you get a recount?
Right.
But they totally left out the fact that if you're going to get a recount in Detroit, that more than 2/3 cannot be recounted.
Because of state law.
Yes.
And the state law says that when those numbers don't match, that you have to go off of the number that was reported.
Yes, and I'm very disappointed in our state legislature because we've known this for a number of years. This subject became apparent to me, and I think most of us that are paying attention to politics, in 2016, because they had a huge number of precincts that didn't match in Detroit back then. And the statement was made, the information came out, well, you can't recount these precincts. And yet nothing's been done to change the law to fix it.
So in a way, and there's kind of a perverse incentive, it would seem, that if you wanted to commit shenanigans with an election, if the ballot box was unbalanced or it didn't match, you would prevent legally any ability to ever challenge that box.
Exactly. And I don't know how far this goes back, probably many decades, but it makes me wonder if the people 5 decades ago or whenever this law got enacted had that purpose in mind to cover up the fraud they were intending on committing.
Now, the second thing you said, which I think is, again, very important, and, big claims require a lot of clarity because we really want to be precise, is you said if a ballot box's seal is broken, that box cannot be recounted.
That's correct. And that was testified to by Monica Palmer last night.
Right. And so could you describe, for the benefit of the people who've never been involved with an election, what that means? So at the counting board, what does the ballot box look like? How is it used? How is it sealed?
I'm trying to remember physically what the ballot box looks like, and I remember Monica Palmer began to describe it. But she described something that was maybe, what would that be? 2.5, 3 feet tall, and maybe this wide. What would they be? 12, 15, 18 inches? And by memory, I think that was a depth. Maybe the width was about this big. So they're fairly large containers. And as I recall, they're large enough for the full-size ballot to lay flat in the bottom. Oftentimes, they're not stacked very well from what I've seen in the past. And the way it worked in Detroit was they had this great big bank of about 24, 25 high-speed tabulators, and they're getting ballots in batches. I think they were trying to keep them in batches of 50 from the boards. Now, keep in mind, each board is a makeup of several precincts. So they've got a little bit of a nightmare trying to keep everything straight. So let's say that board number 55 sends up a batch of ballots. It gets processed through the high-speed tabulator, which communicates by computer and to the master computers. Then they take this group of, let's say it was 50 ballots, and they put it in a box assigned to that board, which is going to be a combination of precincts. And all of that's supposed to be kept straight. Now, when everything is done, one of the last things that they do is to lock and seal that container. And then that's the way it should be, so that if and when you need a recount, you know that hasn't been tampered with.
So the ballots are brought to the counting board, the box is opened.
No. The box is not used in bringing the ballots to the counting board.
Okay.
The box is only used once the ballots are processed through the high-speed tabulator. Then they're put in the box for the, in this case, the counting board.
And when they run through the tabulator, they've already gone through the counting board, the table.
That's correct.
The 5 people. And the ID, the tag has been ripped off. So the ballots, if I'm understanding this correctly, as they're going through the tabulator, those are basically anonymous ballots.
Yes, they are.
And so when they go into the ballot box, they're basically anonymous ballots.
Yes, they are.
The only thing you have to go off of is the voter file of who voted, and then the anonymous ballots that are in the ballot box.
Right.
So when you say 71% of those boxes don't match the number they say voted with the number of ballots that are in there, how could you account for that?
That's a discussion you're going to have with Monica Palmer and Bill Hartman.
Well, they certified that election, so I don't know what answer they're gonna give.
Benjamin, you've just touched on one of my sore point issues, and I'll elaborate a little bit on that. I've gone round and round with Bill Hartman, that I talk to on occasion, of how anyone could possibly certify an election. Now, this is both primarily in the primary. I haven't tried to bother Bill too much now in the general election because he's probably getting enough heat from all directions. But that being said, it makes no sense to me. I've looked up the word certify, which basically says you assert that this is true and correct. There was nothing true and correct about the election in the primary in Detroit. There was absolutely nothing true and correct about the election in Detroit in the general election, and yet they certify it. When I asked Bill back in the primary days, I said, why would you possibly certify this? And he said, we had no choice. There's a deadline, we got to meet it. He said, the attorney told us we had to do it and we had no choice to vote no. And I said, I think he was referring to the Democrat attorney. And I'm thinking, why are you listening to a Democrat attorney on this? And then he said, in addition to that, if we chose not to certify it at the county level, it would go to the state level and they'd certify it anyways. So it's like they're predisposed to certify regardless of the consequences. And I think this is one of the things that's happened for 5 or 6 decades in Detroit, is they've been encouraged and emboldened by this continual stream of certifying an election that should never have been certified. It defies logic.
So the ballot boxes won't have an equal number of ballots in them. Or some ballot boxes might have slightly more, slightly less.
Well, for sure, yeah.
Do you know the number of how many absentee ballots were cast in Detroit or in Wayne County?
I believe, and these are estimates, but I believe in the primary it was around 76,000. Seems like I heard a number of 167,000, and we're talking about the Detroit absent voter county boards.
Right. So I'm sorry, you say 160,000?
I think it was 167,000, I think was the number that was announced over the PA when they were done.
Okay. And so 71% of those, roughly speaking, are in ballot boxes that can't be accounted for.
I would state it a different way.
Sure.
71% of the precincts that may or may not be 71% of the ballots.
Right.
But 71% of the precincts could not be recounted because they were out of balance.
Right.
But, and if I may, the one thing which I think I need to touch on, let me get to the right page here. This is both a request and a demand, if you will. In summary, I believe that massive election law violations were willfully and purposely committed in the November election in the Detroit absent voter county boards. I strongly ask that our state legislature demand that a full, independent, forensic audit be conducted before any consideration of allowing electors to vote in the Electoral College. As a citizen of Michigan, I demand that my constitutional right to an audit, as prescribed by the Michigan Constitution, Article 2, Section 4, 1H, be honored. Respectfully submitted, Bob Cushman.
What is a forensic audit?
A forensic audit is so much more than a recount, because a forensic audit is going to allow the examination of all parts of the election. We're going to go, you would allow the experts to go back and look and see how many of the people that voted were actually real people. How many were in jail? How many were dead? And I just heard somewhere in the last 24, 36 hours that there is a way to differentiate between qualified ballots based on the composition of the cardboard or paper versus ones that are not. I just heard that and I got my attention. I can't verify that, but that would be something that would be huge. And all aspects of the election can be looked at, will be looked at in a forensic audit. And I think that would also include some of the extremely concerning issues about the computer systems. We've had testimony after testimony after testimony of spikes in the numbers of ballots in a short time frame that is totally impossible based on the number of ballots that the tabulators are able to process within an hour or two.
Now there was one Republican member who pushed back on that. I believe it was Representative Steve Johnson. And his point was that his understanding of how precincts are reported is that they're counted, they're tabulated, and then they're reported. And his concern was that the ballot spikes were simply that a precinct was being reported all at once. And so if a very Democrat area or a very Biden area was being reported, that might look like a big spike, but it's really just that precinct reporting all at once.
Johnson may or may not be correct. I'm sure he's quoting somebody else. I'm not qualified to answer that question. But one of the more concerning issues is the fact that the Dominion computer electing system is from a foreign company based in Canada, and that the servers used were in foreign countries and oftentimes in Europe. Germany, and I think one of the Eastern Bloc countries was mentioned as well. So there's a lot of very challenging, interesting questions that really need to be answered, because without a paper ballot and counting a one ballot, numbers can be changed. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was both Colonel, and I can't think of his last name, Colonel that testified last night, and I've seen him testify in Arizona as well. He's a real expert on this stuff. And Pat Colbeck has echoed this, is that oftentimes the reporting of the vote would be in fractions. Now, how does that happen? How do you have a fractional vote?
But to come back to what you personally witnessed, one thing that I think you described was that there were lull periods where no votes were being counted, and that
or very few. There were times where you might find 2, 3, 4 boards that seemed to be shuffling some ballots, and everyone else is just sitting there. Some people were sleeping. It's like.
And votes were certainly being counted up until 8 p.m. on Wednesday. Right?
8 to 10.
8 to 10.
So it's a ballpark, but 8 to 10 p.m. time frame is where I made notes that the very, very last batch of ballots were being processed.
And I don't know about you, but I recall Wayne County reporting some numbers on Tuesday night, on late into Tuesday, Wednesday morning. Numbers were slowly coming in. So certainly you personally witnessed the count go on a lot longer than the votes that were being reported. The votes were certainly being reported piecemeal out of Wayne County.
I cannot comment at all about what you may have seen on television.
Sure.
Because I spent a long day on the 3rd and a long day on the 4th inside Cobo Hall. I never saw daylight on the 3rd or the 4th because I got there before sunup and I left after sunset. And and I didn't have a chance to watch TV at all during the 3rd or the 4th. So.
Well, but my point is, you witnessed the votes being counted up until 10 p.m. on Wednesday night.
Approximately, yeah.
Okay, great.
Right.
Are there any fact issues on either the Senate or the House hearings, since you were present for both, that you witnessed that you think should be corrected? Things that you witnessed? I know that covers a lot of time.
So you're talking about legislation that needs to be enacted on, or
no, of statements that other people made that you observed were either not factually correct, or things that you did observe that you haven't talked about.
One of the answers that might fit into your couching, if you will, is when the Democratic representative was challenging Rudy about why didn't you get a recount? Well, if you can't recount 71 or 72%, it's pretty meaningless. That was a mistake, and that was wrongful. Whether or not he understood that, I'm not sure. But there was another thing that happened that really rubbed me the wrong way. Now, I've been an affiant in a lawsuit that is actually still being processed in the state of Michigan, whereby the initial judge, Judge Kinney, that turned the case away or rejected the case, and it was appealed to the appellate level. Then it was appealed to the Supreme Court level. Now, in the initial turning away of the case, Judge Kinney basically echoed what the Democrat attorney said was, oh, these affiants are not reliable. They're not based in fact. They basically dismissed it with no looking at the actual information at all. Now, when it got to the Supreme Court, and this is something that it was a comment made by one of the Democrat representatives last night.
Representative Camilleri.
I think you're right on that. He made the statement, well, why should we, and he basically tried to discount the testimony that was occurring last night by several of the people giving testimony. Well, Judge Kinney's already said that you're not a reliable witness, or words to that effect, which is really that's not exactly what the judge said. But the important part, and it needs to be made, this point needs to be made, is that the Michigan Supreme Court did a slapdown on Judge Kinney and said, You have totally not looked at the evidence. We order you to have an evidentiary hearing. That evidentiary hearing for Judge Kinney has not happened yet. So the judge that made this dismissal of the case initially has been slapped down by the Michigan Supreme Court. Now, that was never clarified last night. I wish I could have spoken up, but I didn't have the ability.
And that's the lawsuits that's filed in state court, I believe, with the Great Lakes Justice Center.
That is
right?
correct.
And that involves Cheryl Constantina,
Yes.
Senator Colbeck, yourself.
Ed McCall and Constantino
Yeah.
are the plaintiffs,
Yes.
and I'm one of maybe 5 or 6 affiants in that lawsuit. So I'm
You were
trying
on
to keep aware of what's going on with that case.
And I believe they also asked that question of Melissa Carone, the Dominion whistleblower, because Judge Kenny also said that
Yeah,
she was
she's one of the affiants in that case.
That's
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Great. That's all very good. In terms of credibility, do you think that there's any what training have you received in order to be a credible poll watcher, a poll
Challenger.
Right.
Election challenger, I think, is probably the most technical term.
Sure.
I received training in both the primary and the general election. Additionally, I've done a lot of research on my own.
What did the training involve, though?
The training involved a little more than an hour by the attorney Flynn. He at one point he was the election day operations officer. I think he's connected with the Trump campaign, but he seemed to be sequestered with the Michigan Republican Party for a while. I think you or someone else said he's not there anymore, and I assume he's still with the Trump campaign. So he trained us, and then, albeit somewhat late, we got materials. There were official booklets from the Secretary of State on the role and responsibility and limitations of what election challengers, also known as poll challengers, can do or shouldn't do. And then we had that kind of training, except it was much better going forward, both by the Michigan Republican Party and Marion Sheridan. And then additionally to that, based on my experience in the primary, I was allowed to serve as a trainer for the Election Integrity Fund when they were training and certifying their own election challengers.
So you were trained by multiple groups, multiple different types of training, and you've actually become yourself an instructor.
Yes, that's correct.
What's your background?
I'm a mechanical engineer by education, and for most of my adult career, I was a professional pilot. I was a corporate pilot for General Motors.
Great. Anything else you want to add?
I think that's pretty much it, but I would just want to reemphasize and clarify that it is essential, in my opinion, it is essential that we have a full forensic audit, not just some random recounts or some sampling audits that happen after the fact, because we know, and I'm talking about the majority of Republicans in this country, we know this was an extremely fraudulent election, especially in the swing states or deciding states. I was personally an eyewitness to that, not just in the general, but also in the primary election. And here's the big picture. If people do not have confidence in their ability to cast a vote and it being meaningful, we are on the path to losing our country. I cannot overstate that enough. It's not just this election. It's not just about Trump versus Biden. This is about the future of our country. This is a pivotal moment, and our legislature must act to clarify this, and if they don't, I have no faith in the future of this country.
Do you have any faith in the election results reported out of Wayne County?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Of what you witnessed, how many arguably fraudulent votes do you think you personally saw?
My estimate, and it's based in part by testimony from last night, that there was well in excess of 50,000 votes that probably should not have been counted, and those are the votes that were counted. They showed up in the dump on the morning of the 4th and were counted during the morning hours of the 4th. And I can say with an even greater degree of certainty that the several thousand votes that showed up after the military votes should not have been counted. So, it's hard to label a number, but I'd say it could be 60,000 or more very easily. And this is just the Detroit absent voter counting boards.
If you were to extrapolate out, I know this requires a bit of an assumption, and I won't be offended if you don't want to make it. The totality of what you witnessed in terms of the problems, the negligence, the possible fraud that you observed, if you were to apply that to all of the votes coming out of Wayne County, what percentage of those votes would you say are suspect?
Ask the question again.
Taking in the totality of all the things that you observed, all the violations of law that you observed, what percentage of votes in Wayne County, absentee, in person, all the above, would you consider suspect?
I can't give you a percentage on that. It would be irresponsible for me to do that.
Sure.
What I can do is give you a subjective statement, and that is there was a very large percentage of fraudulent votes that happened. I'm not qualified to give you a number, but there's no way this election should have been certified. And if I can take off on a tangent, what I've observed, and I've been to Trump rallies, and I've observed Trump rallies in person and on television. I've looked at the rallies for Biden, and I know the level and the fervor of support that President Trump has, and there is absolutely no way that he lost this election. He didn't, once you discount the fraud. It's impossible.
Great. Last question. Did anybody pay you to make the statement?
No, and I'll make a general statement. Not only have I not been paid by anybody, I've spent a lot of money over the years just to be involved with politics, whether it's driving Senator Pat Kobach around on my nickel to run for governor, or attending state conventions at an away site where I have to rent a room or something. So no, I haven't made one thin dime, and I've spent a lot of money.
Has anybody tried to influence your testimony or try to pressure you to say things that?
No.
Great.
No,
Great.
not at all.
Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.